Welcome to this week's edition of Word of Truth Podcast. This is Jordan.
And this is Jaron. And this week we're continuing with part 2 of our study of the 400 years. Last week we looked at it from a very high level, what was going on, like worldview type scope. And this year we're going to focus, or not this year, this week we're going to focus a little bit more we're going to narrow the scope and look specifically at the Jews and what happened with them during this intertestamental 400 years. And I thought of a great title for this because I think it fits pretty well with what we're going to talk about, called How to Waste 400 Years. And so I think the reason I came up with that is because when you look at the 400 years, they have no revelation from God for this 400 years, which was the first time that happened in a long time.
Quick question. I had a tab come up on my screen. Is there a heart beating on your screen? No, just on mine. Okay.
Down in the corner?
Yeah.
Yeah, you can react to the video.
Oh, okay. I thought that's the first time I was like, I did not just click that.
Anyways, focus. But so we're talking about the 400 years with the Jews, how to waste 400 years, because they're given this period of time where there's no new revelation from God. There's no communication from God to his people, which is the first time that this has happened since the beginning of the Old Testament. And so with that being the case, for the 400 years, they're given this period of time, as we soon find out with the coming of the New Testament, to reflect, to study it, to get ready and be prepared for what's coming next, being the Messiah. And so if this time were used properly, if they were to redeem the time as they should have, they would have been ready for when Christ came. They would have known what to be looking for. They would have known, the prophecies that would come to identify him. They would have known these types of things when he comes. However, we find that this is not how the 400 years are used, and rather there are some things that set the stage for Christ's coming, but the Jews really go further away from God and splinter even more than they were at the close of the Old Testament. And so with that to begin, I think we want to look at the various sects of the Jews, the various divisions of them.
Yeah, so when we look at this, one that's common is going to be the Pharisees. Now, the Pharisees, when they came about, their whole purpose was to bring Israel back to their righteousness and their holiness. And that's why we see them being so devout, so and striving to be or hold up these old traditions. They were viewed as the holy group. They were not so much political as they were religious. So everything that they did was to try and bring Israel back to that former relationship with God. Because as we know, when we leave off with the Israelites in the Old Testament, the priesthood, they have already left the truth, and they're defiling their practice. They're not making sacrifices that are pleasing in the eyes of God, and as they are to be the leaders at that time, and they're not doing their part, the people of Israel are no longer following. Now, what we want to make note of is this is not an establishment that was set up in the law of Moses, right? This is a man-made group here. So we want to kind of be careful with that as we strive to keep God's word, and we want to be holy. We want to do it within the confines of what he has given us. And that's what they should have done. They should have been looking, and they should have been purifying the priesthood, not just allowing anybody to become a priest, and making sure that the priests at that time were doing their job and leading the people as they were to be leading in holiness and righteousness, right? That was not supposed to be a role for the Pharisees.
Yeah, and so when you look at the word Pharisee, it means separate ones, and this was used more of a term of ridicule when referring to them, because they held themselves, as you're kind of saying, to the higher level. They continually put safeguards. They called themselves the Haddusim within the sect of the Pharisees. That means the pious ones, and the pious ones, not pious ones, pious ones. And that's how they viewed themselves. They viewed themselves as such because they resisted the Hellenistic influences of Greece. They put in all of those barriers to make sure that they're trying to live as righteously as possible and viewed themselves as being the most righteous of the people. And this appealed to the general public as they looked up to these people as the religious standard. They were put kind of on that pedestal.
And as you study and you go through uh, the gospel accounts and you see Christ's interaction with the Pharisees, you understand more of what he's trying to address, right? Because they are often viewed as, and today we have this negative connotation, right? That's self-righteousness. Most of them, I would say, did not do this and serve out of like ill intent to treat others poorly, but more out of a belief that this is how it has to be for us to get Israel back on track. And the people would have looked at them and looked to them as the example, right? These are men who have spent years and years studying the Word of God, studying the law of Moses, which is what they would have had. Um, and they would have had a better understanding than us who are common people. So we're going to look to them for this guidance, and they are going to be the ones leading us spiritually. And when you look at them, they dress differently than everybody else. Um, and you see, right, as they would question Christ, why would you eat with a tax collector and sinners, right? Why would you be at their house? You need to be separate, again, and going to their name, right, set apart. Um, and so when you look at that, it and you understand more of the background for the Pharisees, it helps you understand more of Christ's teachings when he deals with them in the parables. Now, I think it's also good if we kind of hit on some things here, maybe in a minute, that they believed and that they practiced.
Yeah. Before we hit on that, I want to tie in the scribes because the scribes are really what helped to create the Pharisees. So the scribes have been around for most of the Old Testament, but they were kind of just a part of it. They were the ones who wrote down the day to day what was happening. Best seen in like First and Second Chronicles, First and Second Kings, those types of things. The scribes wrote down basically the records of what was happening. They were some of the only literate people within the culture, those who were able to write down, document, and then read that to the people. And because of this, their job was to interpret and read the law to the people. So they were seen as kind of the teachers. Um, and so with this, they created what was the great men of the assembly. It's claimed to be created around Ezra's time, that consisted of mainly the scribes and a couple of prophets and shamans and stuff like that. About 120 people. And they were seen as the authority since these were the men who either were getting direct word from God or knew what God had written before. And so this then kind of shifts this idea of the authority of the people into what became the Sanhedrin, which then was ruled by partly scribes, mainly Pharisees, that we see throughout much of the New Testament.
Well, you'll also see that there are priests who were able to serve in the Sanhedrin as well. So you're going to have all these different groups kind of represented there to have a diversity of opinion.
Yeah, yeah, and that it kind of morphs and changes as time goes on. Um, but yeah, so these people were seen as the guardians of the law. They were the teachers of the law. They were the authority of the law. And over time, part of the scribes kind of shifted to form the establishment of the Pharisees. And this happened because as they became the authority of the law, they began to institute their own rules, putting more emphasis on those and the traditions that they implemented to keep people following the law. They put up a lot of the guardrails that we see followed by the Pharisees, and put an emphasis on what they call the quote unquote oral law, which are the laws that they came up with that they then claimed was given to Moses by God and translated through history, just not written down. And they also play a huge role as the teachers in establishing synagogues, which we may get into a little bit later, and the schools that they were trained in, that a lot of the Pharisees then, they were taught there, became rabbis, then Pharisees. And, within this establishment that they created, the school systems and such, comes the rise of the Pharisees. Um, And so, with that being said, if you want to go ahead and start with a little bit of what you were thinking on for, their beliefs and such.
Yeah, so when we get into the New Testament, and we see Christ dealing, you see in every situation that he's approached by any one of these groups, or most of the time, you see representatives from both. And the whole idea was if we send, a Pharisee and a Sadducee, or the scribe of a Pharisee and scribe of the Sadducees, no matter how he answers, he's going to answer incorrectly. But each time he answers it perfectly by teaching them both on how they are wrong. For the Pharisees, they believed uh, in the resurrection. And this is going to be like the main sticking point. Paul actually uses this when he's taken in the custody in Rome. He uses this and pins the Jewish people against themselves because the Sadducees did not believe in the resurrection. And what's weird is that they believe that after death, that there was a place where the dead would go, both the righteous and the unrighteous, where you were separated and cut off from life, but you would not be cut off from God. So it's like a weird, like, you don't think that there's a resurrection, but you think that there's a place after death where
Yeah.
the righteous and the unrighteous are separated, but neither are separated from God. And those who are righteous are in what is considered to be like a paradise. So I haven't really gotten to the intricacies of what they really believed and how that differs. Um, but they did not believe that man could be resurrected after he was dead, or after he died. But the Pharisees, they did. And that's where, when you look at the Pharisees, what they believed, it was pretty close with what was being taught and what they needed to believe. However, they could not open up their eyes to see that Jesus was the Son of God. Because what was the main misunderstanding of the time, I think that we brought it up before, is that there would be a physical kingdom reestablished that was like what they had enjoyed during the reign of David and during the reign of Saul. So you want to see the righteousness during the kingdom of David, but then the peace and the wealth during the kingdom of Saul or Solomon. Sorry. So that's what they were looking for. And when you look at the Pharisees, a lot that they believed was so close to what they needed to believe to be saved. Yet in that one spot, they fell short. For the Sadducees, they were more of a political group. They were more worried about keeping the tithes. And I'm not going to say that's not important, because I do think that it was for Jewish life to continue, where they wouldn't be so heavily influenced by Roman culture, which soon enough they will be. Um, but they were more of the political group that handled Rome and the officials and the governors of that time. And again, that's where the Pharisees and Sadducees are very different in what their role in Jewish society is.
Yeah.
The scribes, those are more like our, um, like lawyers. They are serving to handle these legal documents, and they would have a good knowledge not only of the law of God, and write that down and record that and teach it to the people, but also the laws of the land that they needed to obey, and help keep the people, the Jewish people, in line with that, as long as they didn't perceive it to be something that withheld them from obeying their truth, or following the Old Testament.
Yeah.
So,
And quick note with talking about the difference between the Pharisees and the Sadducees, you made a couple of important distinctions, but to know the extent of it, they viewed themselves as bitter enemies through a lot of this period of time until they decide to kind of unify over trying to kill Christ. But they even had a civil war throughout this intertestamental period. And the Sadducees were complete political opposites, as you were mentioning with the Pharisees. They were to the point where they actually brought in Roman influence in 63 AD. They brought them in to try and first execute the Pharisees and put their influence over the Judean realm. So for this group of people, they were quick to adopt the Greek influence in Hellenistic or Hellenism, where the Pharisees wanted to be separate from it. And so these put them at, different ends of the spectrum on the Jewish culture, to where they oftentimes were button heads and were very, very, very um, against each other throughout much of this history.
Yeah. Um, and another group that kind of ties into all of this, and you see their encounter um, is the Herodians. Now, each of these groups are enemies of one another. The
Yeah,
Herodians were looking for to go back to what it was like with Herod, um, Herod the First. And but when we look at this, then I'd forgotten for a second. You know what you were just saying. It reminds me of that quote: "The enemy of my enemy is my friend." So
yeah,
the Sadducees and the Pharisees were enemies of what Christ was trying to teach. Therefore, they united to try and defeat him. But again, they couldn't. In every way that they tried, they could not defeat him. But I just kind of wanted to throw that out there.
yeah. And so you brought up the Herodians. Now they were kind of like they were actually pretty close to the Sadducees, and some think that they were Sadducees just more religious. So like the Sadducees, but like a step past them on the spectrum. Um, and so they wielded a lot of political power because they submitted to Rome, and they, really appealed to Herod to make. They looked for him to be kind of the coming of the Messiah and restore the David type reign. They thought it would be through a Herodian dynasty, is how that would come about. And so that's kind of what their mindset was. Where the Sadducees, they wanted to have like Jewish self government over the area, but they appealed more to Rome. The Herodians wanted Rome to cause that kingdom to happen.
Yeah.
And
And
then,
that's where they were opposed with the Pharisees because
yeah,
the Herodians wanted someone, the son of Herod the Great, and that lineage, but the Pharisees wanted the son of David,
yeah,
which they had, but
yeah, but they didn't look and
yeah,
realize
they
it.
weren't looking in the right way.
So we've hit the Pharisees and the Sadducees on the spectrum, and then the Herodians are slightly past the Sadducees. And then you have the Zealots, which are on the other hand, or on the other side of the Pharisees, like the extreme on that end. And for them, they were looked at as kind of like the terrorists. They were a band of guerrilla warriors of Jews, very, very opposed to Rome, very, very opposed to the Herodians. And they're basically the entire purpose of this group was to incite rebellion against Rome. Like that was almost the sole purpose: get rid of Rome and let the Jews rule over the area.
And we have an example of when you look in the gospel account towards the end of Christ's life, right? His life is exchanged for the life of Barabbas. And Barabbas is a zealot, one who helped lead an insurrection. So again, we see the zealots, they're not just early on with the Maccabean Wars, but they continue all the way through, even up until the time of Christ, and then you'll find it afterwards as well. But
Yeah. And then so with that, then you have the Essenes. I think I said that right. Essenes.
mhm.
They're actually a relatively small group of the Jews, but they're extremely important when it comes to the preservation of the Old Testament. The Dead Sea Scrolls, which is one of our main sources of, the manuscripts of the Old Testament, come from this group as they were very studious. They were literate. They wrote down multiple copies of that, and they were ended up being preserved in a cave for us then to find and be able to restore the Old Testament for us to have it today.
um, I have a little bit from what Josephus wrote regarding the Essenes. He says that they were Jews by birth and seem to have a greater affection for one another than the other sects have. They reject pleasures as an evil, but esteem continence and conquest over passions to be virtue. They neglect wedlock, but choose out of other persons' children to be their kindred, and form them according to their manners. They do not absolutely deny the fitness of marriage and the succession of mankind thereby continued, but they guard against lasciviousness, behavior of women. They are despisers of riches, nor is anyone to be found among them more among them who has more than another. Let what they have be common to the whole order. So here we have people who were set apart, and they tried to remain, um, oh, what is it? Single, and they were a group
Celibate. That's the word.
celibate, yeah. Um, and what they would do is they would have everything in common and share everything with one another. And so in this, again, they varied greatly from the Pharisees and the Sadducees because they also did not live in one central location. They often did not even live in a city, but they wanted to remove themselves from that. And they would live in the caves around where the Dead Sea was, which is why we have the Dead Sea Scrolls. Um, and they wanted to completely remove themselves from the world. And again, that's something that Christ, he doesn't directly address the Essenes, but their beliefs he does address in his teachings. And Paul even talks about, right? You're going to have to live in this world, but not be of the world. Where they tried to just completely remove themselves. And how are we going to teach anybody if we completely remove ourselves from the world, and people of the world, right? We don't need to practice in sin, but we need to help teach them. And this is one area where the Essenes were wrong.
Yeah. And then the last group of the Christians are the Nazarenes. Now, these didn't rise until Christ actually came and died. Um, this group, the Nazarenes, they were the ones that believed Christ was the Messiah. And it's a term used of reproach, like because Christ was from Nazareth, and for whatever reason, people from there had a very bad reputation. And so to be called a Nazarene wasn't, you didn't want to be called that. Uh, but then they used it to call that group of that group of Jews who followed Christ before the term Christian was coined in Antioch, before they started calling themselves those of the way. They were considered Nazarenes. And so, with that, those are the seven groups of Jews that were in this time period, and they all play a big role throughout the New Testament, which maybe that can be a series that we do, later on down the road, is talking about, how this 400 years plays out then throughout the New Testament. Um, but so all of these people rose, and then, oh, go ahead.
I was gonna say I've got some stuff that we did, or I prepared for the high school class about 2 years ago here. Um, I was thinking maybe if we get the files together, we can upload that stuff too, because I
Yep.
have works of Josephus and everything kind of mixed in, um, to help give an understanding in case somebody was a little confused with something that we said.
Yeah, we'll do that. We'll put those up on the extra tidbits page on our website, which is awordoftruth.org. Um, I believe that's linked in our Instagram page. And if it's not on, if it should be on Facebook, if it's not on YouTube, I'll put it up there in a description or something like that, to help for a little bit further study into these groups. Um, and then the last thing I wanted to hit on were kind of things that happened with the Jews in this time period that played or had major implications then in the New Testament. So first, the rise of synagogues. We kind of hit on this a little bit, but these were seen as like the cultural centers of Jewish life. It's where you went if you wanted to learn, if you wanted to read the scripture, if you wanted to be like worship with one another or just be in the community of Jews. You would be at the synagogue at some point throughout the week, and especially on Saturdays for the Sabbath. So these, as they rose, became the epicenters, and we find that they're used then throughout the New Testament for as Christianity is spreading for those who are teaching it to find a large group of people to then proclaim the gospel to. And so the rise of synagogues are huge in the spread of the gospel. And then also the Sanhedrin, as we kind of talked about, they rose, and this plays a huge role in getting Christ onto the cross. They're the ruling body that kind of drives the Jews against Christ and ultimately leads to them putting him up to be sacrificed for us on the cross. Um, And then also, as we talked about, having the Dead Sea Scrolls written allowed for us to now have a lot of the Old Testament in its form for us to read today. And so those were three major takeaways of this 400 years that have huge implications outside of, the division of the Jews, that we should keep in mind as we go through and study the New Testament.
Well, with that, I want to thank you guys for listening in this week. Um, I don't know what else your spiel goes.
Uh,
What else did I
We'd like to
say?
thank you all for listening in to this week's edition of the Word of Truth podcast. Next week, we're going to be diving in one more layer on this discussion, and we'll be looking at God's hand in how all of this plays out. So we're going to see how God's hand plays within the realm of the kingdoms coming, such as the empires of Greece and Rome, and how God used that to set up the New Testament. We're going to talk about how God's hand was even in what happened with the Jews and their divisions and how that led to the rise of the things that we kind of talked about. And then we hope that you've gained something from this discussion. We hope that you've been edified and that you've deepened your knowledge in some way. And we'd like to thank you and remind you that he who has ears to hear,
Listen
listen
up.
up. Hey, that one was actually good, I think. I couldn't hear you. But, uh, and as always, have a great weekend.